Good to see everybody this evening. We are in our series of Wisdom Calls. We're talking about the images and messages that we can learn from the Proverbs. And we're not looking at every single proverb or every single verse of each of the Proverbs. Jeff Smith wrote this book called Wisdom Calls that we're using. We're adapting, I guess, maybe in some ways to our purposes here in our Bible study. And so we're going to continue those discussions together this evening out of Proverbs 16 and verse 7. Where we learn about the idea of keeping peace and how we can keep peace with others. But before we get into our study tonight, if you would, let's bow our heads together and let's share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for blessing us with an opportunity to come together to study your word, to appreciate your message and the importance of it. Give us the courage as students of your word to not just learn the message, but to apply it, to use it, to benefit from your guidance and your counsel that comes from the testimony of your word. Strengthen us in our efforts tonight. Encourage us in all that's right and good. And we pray this through your Son's name. Amen. So tonight this proverb simply says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. And it's kind of an interesting concept, and we can go various ways in some ways from this particular text. But this kind of extreme, if you will, is when a man aligns himself with God, what happens? Good things, right? And that's scary, Bill, because that's the exact two words I had in my mind when I asked that question. And when people connect with me that way, it's bad for you. But anyway, right, good things happen. When you align yourself with Jehovah, good things happen. And that doesn't mean nothing hard or difficult or tragic or whatever never happens. It just means when we align ourselves with the will and purposes of God, positive things occur. To the extent that, and here's what the proverb says, even to the point of being able to do what? Make peace with your enemies. Things that seem to be impossible, things that seem to be out of reach, things that most might conclude could never occur, can occur when you apply yourself to Jehovah first. Now, I think that's really the core of this thought, right? And we're going to have a conversation about making peace with others and staying in those relationships and the cautions that we can learn. But keep in mind the idea is all kinds of good things happen, not just peace with our enemies, but all kinds of good things happen when we align ourselves with Jehovah. And so let's just start this process of our conversation tonight with the first question we asked, and that was, is it easy to make peace with an enemy? That's not a fair question, is it? No, right? No. And generally, why? Okay, there's animosity, obviously some challenge that created this definition of somebody being an enemy. Generally, why don't people make peace? That's a weird way to ask that, but maybe you'll understand what I mean here in a minute. Okay, they like strife, or they don't want peace. They want it. A lot of times people don't make peace with you because they don't want peace. They like the strife. They like the difficulty. They want to reside there. They don't want to be agreeable. They don't want to resolve the problem. They have no desire to fix what's challenging or troubling the situation. And sometimes you'll run into folks like that. What seems insurmountable may only be surmountable with the help of whom? The God of heaven, right? That's the messaging tonight. Even what seems almost impossible or non-plausible becomes plausible and possible with God's help. Even though it's not easy. It's never an easy task, because generally to resolve conflict that would equate to the idea of being in challenge with an enemy takes what on one or both people's part? Yeah. Compromise, concession maybe, humility. All of those things are going to be necessary to resolve a challenge that would equate to the idea of being described as enemies. Thoughts or questions about the generic idea before we dig in? Okay, so the next question then asks this: are all conflicts avoidable? No. You're not always going to be able to just navigate in such a way that you never end up in conflict with anybody. Do we sometimes try to do that? Yeah, we may go to great lengths at times to avoid conflict and challenge and difficulty. We'll talk more about how truth enters into that conversation before our study's done tonight. But just from a very basic standpoint, most of us try to avoid, right, any kind of conflict that would create animosity or challenge or arguments and things that would rob us or others of peace. And so we may try to avoid it, but the truth is some of those conflicts and challenges aren't always avoidable. What did Jesus teach concerning that problem in Matthew 10? Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting text, right? Because we think of Jesus described biblically as the Prince of Peace, right? And in so many senses, He is the Prince of Peace. But there are elements of what Jesus did when He came and presented a message that not everybody was going to what? Agree with, right? Not everybody was going to line up in line with the message that Jesus delivers. And because of that, that created conflict between those who were embracing His message and those who did not, even within what? Even within people's families. Jesus recognized that even within physical families, there would be conflict and challenge when some would embrace what He had to say and others were to reject it. Within your material, this is what Jeff wrote. He said, the Bible urges the Christian to strive for peace with all of his neighbors and fellow humans. But sometimes that is next to impossible, especially when the Lord Himself warned that the kingdom would bring division to certain relationships, even close ones. And that's what Matthew 10 described. It's not pleasant. It's not what we would want, right? We can use all the qualifiers that we would like in that discussion, but the reality is there are going to be moments when you do what is right that it's not going to be well received. And it's going to create challenge. And people are going to create friction and difficulties because of it. Our challenge or our goal in that mindset is to persevere with what is right, even when it may, for the moment, take away the peace that we are seeking. Your thoughts or comments that you might have written down or had in relationship to that question. So add then the text itself. Notice what he said, verse 34 of Matthew chapter 10. Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And I've always said, boy, that relationship really needed a lot of help to begin with, right? And then you've got this going. But anyway, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. And when Jesus makes that statement in Matthew 10, I don't think he's not saying it from a, well, it's trivial, it doesn't really matter, don't worry about it, it's not going to be hard for you to deal with. I don't think he's downsizing or oversimplifying the realities. What he's simply saying is this is going to happen. There are going to be times where people embrace me and it causes challenge and difficulties even close to home, and we still have to choose what? The way of the Lord, right? We still have to choose the way of the Lord in those circumstances. And I think Jesus maybe is trying to challenge His disciples, His followers, to appreciate that serving Him isn't always going to be what? It's not always going to be easy. It's going to put you in conflict at times. It's not always going to be easy. What are you going to do in that moment when it's not the casual acquaintance that you see once in a while? It's not just the coworker that you've got to deal with for 2 or 3 hours during the day. What are you going to do when it's the person you wake up in the same household with every day? What are you going to do when this challenge, this difficulty, this lack of peace hits close to home? And Jesus is challenging His disciples to realize that you're not always going to be able to just avoid it. Some circumstances just happen upon you, and you're dealing with it whether you like it or not. You know, it's like once somebody said, you know, grizzly bear jumps you, you're in a fight whether you want it or not, right? There's not much you can do about it. You're in it. And sometimes that happens in life. The challenges come, and as much as we may have tried to avoid it or done our best to create a path that allowed us to not have the turmoil, it may still arrive. And we've got to be faithful enough to the Lord to stay the course with Him, even in the midst of those challenges. Go ahead, Sharon. I'll come back. No, go ahead, Sharon. I'll come back to you.
I forgot what. So I've always felt like this was kind of hard to understand. But as I'm getting older, I think it's not that you can't love your family. You have to love the Lord more.
Yeah.
And show them that you're putting Him first above them.
Yeah. And I don't believe Jesus at all here in this text in Matthew chapter 10 is saying that this is a requirement or it's going to happen in every situation. I think what He's doing is He's warning His disciples, this is how challenging it can be. Will you place me as a priority if it does? Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Gary.
Just flash back to the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers.
Yeah.
And they shall be called.
Yeah. Sons of God. I always, anytime I mention that out of those Beatitudes, that blessed are the peacemakers, I like the word peacemaker, right? Because that shows action. We got a lot of peace wishers, right? You got a lot of people that wish for peace, but don't make any real effort to create peace and work towards peace and make for peace. Jesus said He's not looking for peace wishers. He's looking for peacemakers, and people that work hard and diligent to make peace. And we'll talk about our role in that, Lord willing, before we're done tonight in another aspect of our study. So the next question we ask then, do good men sometimes have to work through challenges? Again, I'm asking pretty obvious questions initially. And I'm put you in your, I think in your daily reading sections, Acts 15, added it to our study. There were two specific contentions mentioned in Acts 15. What were those contentions and how were the problems resolved? And so there were two basic contentions that happened in that text, one at the beginning and one at the end of the text, if you read through the entire chapter. The first one was what? Over circumcision, right? You've got these Judaizing teachers that are basically saying, if you don't circumcise, you're not going to heaven. I'm paraphrasing big time, but that's basically what they're saying. That it's a requirement under the New Testament law for circumcision to occur. And in fact, and I think I can bring that text up on the screen for you, that there was a pretty bold and challenging argument over it. Notice verses 1 and 2 of chapter 15. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren, and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. You can't go to heaven. That's my paraphrase. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, pause. That's interesting, right? If you know what the last contention in Acts 15 is, that's an interesting moment because under this problem, they are united. They're going to have difficulty at the end of the chapter. But here are two men who had the ability to see a challenge and work together to try to resolve it. So they've had no small disputation or dissension over this matter with them there. And they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem. And remember, you always go up to Jerusalem, even though they were going south geographically and then up. But Jerusalem sits up, and so you always go up no matter what side you're coming from. And so they would go up to Jerusalem under the apostles and elders about the question. Quick lesson then. So when you find yourself in conflict with others, and if your real desire is to make peace with this and resolve it, then sometimes it's beneficial to do what? Yeah. Bring some help into that equation. Find some individuals, and for them, it's a spiritual question, a religious matter, a matter of people's salvation at stake. So they went to the best source they had. They went back down to Jerusalem where most of the apostles had stayed, right? It's kind of interesting. We sometimes forget that there were, how many of them? Not insulting here. There were 12, and then if you add Paul later, right, that's 13. And if Barnabas is later considered at one point an apostle, so maybe 14 total by the time you get through that process. But not all of them were what we might call evangelistic in terms of travel. They didn't all just pick up and leave the Jerusalem area and begin to travel like Peter had done some, and Paul had done some, and Barnabas does. Many of them stayed right there at home. And so when the problem arose here and they needed to seek answer, they needed to get to where there was a bulk of knowledge that they could resource, and that place was Jerusalem. The rest and remaining of the apostles, the elders that were there in Jerusalem, they could help them address this challenge. They sought help. Sometimes we can just argue, fuss, and fight all day long, and get nowhere, right? We get nowhere. And maybe the wisdom of these men is, and by the way, who in that setting, before, in Antioch, before they go down to Jerusalem, who's got the wisdom on their side? Not Paul and Barnabas do, right? These are the men of God. These are the men that God had chosen, right, to go out and serve this purpose. They are the ones that were commissioned, if you will, to go on this first missionary journey to go out and do this work. They've got the superior knowledge. But what I love about them is they didn't just pound these folks with their authority and say, I'm right on this because I came from God's work and purposes. I'm the one God chose for these things. You all need to listen to me, right? They could have gone that way. But what I love about them is if they really want to resolve it and make peace with it, let's include some other voices that might help us solidify this. They had no small dissension and disputation over it, the text says. But when they realized that was getting them nowhere, let's find a path that moved forward. Okay, we can all agree. Let's all go down, send some people down, and let's talk to the elders and the apostles about this and see if we can get this question resolved so we have an answer, particularly about circumcision, and I'll learn some other things with this council along the way. Go ahead, Judy.
When they went to Jerusalem, the ones that were there had been with Jesus the whole time, so they would know if he had said, just even in passing, well, I think we should have circumcision all the time too.
Yeah. That there would be a much larger wealth of knowledge and wisdom there when they get there to resolve the problem that they had. So, go ahead, Bill. Say it one time.
Supernatural knowledge.
Yeah, there was superior knowledge, supernatural knowledge, the wisdom of God and inspirations involved as well. And if you read through the narrative, the Holy Spirit intervenes and gets involved in making sure they understand what the truth on that situation is. But what I wanted us to appreciate simply though is that it's okay to seek some counsel sometimes and some aid and some secondary wisdom and allow for that aid and help to maybe guide us through resolving conflict or challenge. What was the other problem there in that text? Okay, so on this first missionary journey they had been on, they had taken a fellow by the name of John Mark with them. And John Mark, somewhere partway through the travels, right, decides, I'm not so sure this is going so well. He decides to return back home. That bothered Paul enough that when they decide here towards the end of chapter 15 of Acts to embark on a second trip, Barnabas basically says what about John Mark? Let's give him what? Let's give him another chance. And by the way, that's kind of the guy Barnabas was, right? He's by name, he's the encourager. His very makeup and thought processes and the way he entreated people was to try to encourage and aid and help them. And so he's willing to kind of let all that history be history and take John Mark with him. Paul says what? No, right? No, this is not going to work. How can we allow for this to occur? Just notice the language from the text. Verse 37 of Acts 15. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to the work. And the contention was so sharp between them, that they departed asunder from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus. Paul takes Silas, right? And they go in a different direction. Sometimes, to help make peace in the moment, wisdom tells us to do what? Yeah, separate. To remove yourself from the argument. I mean, what value would it have been for Paul and Barnabas just to go all night long, back and forth. He's going. No, he's not going. He's going. No, he's not going. Right? But here's the beauty of it. I think sometimes we forget. The argument was firm. I think the text indicates that this wasn't just, what do you think kind of conversation. It had some fervor to it. But their decision to go two different ways isn't just about making peace, but it's also about what? What are they going to do? Yeah, they're going to double the work that they're able to accomplish by making this decision. Sometimes the answer that helps resolve conflict might very well not just be able to be the thing that helps take a tense situation and put it to rest, but it may actually be the best answer to actually fulfill the purpose and work or whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish in better ways. Sometimes it's just best to disconnect. And we can argue, fuss, and fight with folks all night long. And if it's not really resolving anything, nobody's getting any better because of it, no real permanent benefit is coming from it. We can talk scripturally about all kinds of things where people argue over words and the Bible's warnings about those kinds of things and difficulties that come. But sometimes the better answer is just to disconnect. Now, somebody don't over-qualify what I'm saying. Bible has restrictions about marriages. You can't just get up and walk away and not try to resolve it. And those guys, I get all that. But when it comes to general senses, sometimes a disconnect. And even the Bible would talk about, even in marriage, sometimes for praying and fasting, to get your spiritual mind back in order, disconnect's okay for a short period of time. So there's valuable lessons, I think, in both of these circumstances that you see here in Acts chapter 15. And the end result is peace.
This man, he said, I don't think we need to do this.
Yeah.
He was a vital part of his role at the, Colossian church.
Yeah. When you come back towards the end of Paul's work, you'll see John Mark re-enter the picture, and Paul speaks of him favorably. You kind of wonder if they had just kept slugging it out in that moment, would that eventual benefit ever be able to come to fruition? And we appreciate that from history. So let's change to a different example. That within your notes and within the study, we talk a little bit about Lot within that. And I asked, how was Lot described in 2 Peter chapter 2? Yeah, just or righteous. One that was what in relationship to the immorality that was around him? Yeah, say it one more time, sir. Yeah, vexed. That's not necessarily a word we would commonly use, but he's troubled by it, right? It bothered him. When he witnessed the sins and the immorality that was rampant around him there in Sodom and Gomorrah, he was bothered by it because he was a just man, and his heart was vexed over that. And I simply, so what does that teach us concerning his reaction to a wicked world? He doesn't want to make what with the wicked world? Peace, right? That's the point I think the text is driving at. I'm not saying he was walking up and down the streets of Sodom and Gomorrah picking fights with people. That's not what I'm implying. But in order to keep peace with the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah, he was not willing to give up his just character in order to accomplish that. And I think that's the imagery that Peter's trying to record for us there in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked. If that's the description Peter has of Lot, when you think back to Genesis chapter 19, you think about that scene as it unfolds. You can only imagine how mortified he must have been as the end draws near. And all of those circumstances and things that occurred with those messengers of God that had come there and to remind him and their guests in his home, and that whole scene unfolds. A just man was vexed by the filthy conversation of the wicked. And his goal wasn't to try to simply pacify those things and to give in, if you will, to their immorality just to keep peace. Here's what Jeff wrote about that. He said, sometimes living a holy life brings one into conflict with the people around him, and there is just no avoiding it. Righteous Lot was vexed each day by the immoral conduct of the Sodomites about him, and when he tried to repel their invasion of his home, they noted that he came to dwell among them and had begun acting as their judge. Pause for a minute, right? That's the imagery sometimes we forget. That was the accusation they made. You came to reside with us, and now you're going to judge over us? Now you're going to tell us how to live and conduct ourselves? I think the implication of that is that Lot was vocal about the behaviors. He didn't just stay silent in order to make sure he didn't ruffle any feathers. He's vocal about that. Refusing to cooperate with dishonest or otherwise immoral projects will often make the Christian an unwelcome presence. Anybody ever felt like an unwelcome presence? Don't raise your hand. But all of us probably have at some point. Where your very presence created friction and conflict because there were people who wanted to behave a certain way, and now that's going to be strained or challenged or bothered because you arrived and you're present in that situation. Or because you're willing to be vocal about things that you don't approve of and the things that trouble you. It's hard sometimes, right? It's one thing to recognize that people have free will, right? And people can have the ability. God has given the power to all men to choose make moral decisions, and we can make them right or wrong, and we can face consequences based on that, right? God's given us that power, but it's hard sometimes when maybe it's your environment, and you have to say to somebody, listen, I can't tell you what to do outside of my home, but I can tell you as for me in my house, right? Those are awkward moments. Those are challenging moments where we might have to stand up for morality and biblical principles when we know the minute we do, it can create a lack of peace or uncomfortableness in that situation. And yet we still got to do it. And we still have to stand up for what's true and right, even when the accusations of, well, you're creating a problem or you're making a problem. We're never the source of the problem when you're striving to do what's right and good and moral based in God's standard. So where were the problems then arising from for those Christians that Peter was talking to in 2 Peter chapter 2? He uses Lot as a reference point, but there was another issue they were dealing with. What was it? False teachers, right? They were dealing with false teachers, Peter talks to them about. And they had these influences that were among them that were trying to persuade them away from what? The truth. They're trying to persuade them away from what was true. Just notice the language of the text, verse 1 of 2 Peter chapter 2. But there were false prophets also among the people. Pause for a minute, just a quick lesson. False prophets in the days of Peter, false prophets in the days of everybody, right? They didn't start in the days of Peter, they didn't end in the days of Peter. There have always been folks who have tried to persuade people away from the truth of what God has said. We've always had that to have to deal with. And when you confront a false prophet, when you confront a teaching that doesn't fit within what God's scriptures teach, that's going to create conflict and a lack of peace. It just happens. And Peter was concerned about those in his day that would they have the fortitude to kind of face those challenges. There were false prophets also among the people, even as there shall be false teachers among you. The scary word there, by the way, to me is the word among, right? It's one thing if some fella come off the street and walked in here and started preaching and espousing something that was, or saying something that was inaccurate according to God's word. Be one thing to try to address that, right? Somebody that's not really connected just kind of shows up and begins to say or do something that's contrary to the will of God. We might step in really quickly and address this. Peter says the greater challenge for these folks was these individuals that were going to be presenting things that were untrue were going to crop up from among them. Well, that's going to be uncomfortable, isn't it? When somebody that's connected to these groups of people begin to teach something that's contrary to the will of God, and now we've got to step in and address it and deal with it. And my point, friends, is simply this, that sometimes the lack of peace comes, or the conflicts come, when we stand up and do what is right, because it happens within the walls. He says, there are false teachers among you who privily shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that brought them, and bring upon themselves swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. Peter's warning them, listen, peace is beautiful and wonderful. We should seek after it. We should make for it. We should do everything that we can to create environments that are peaceful. But the one thing you can't sacrifice is what? Truth. You can't sacrifice truth to make it happen. Truth is like the one piece of the puzzle, if you will, that you can't say, well, we can do without that. It's always got to be present. The truth always has to be present. And if the conflict is a result of making sure we're seeking after what is true, then we may not be able to avoid that circumstance. Though not always easy, I asked a second question. Though not always easy, is it possible to be peaceable even in challenging environments? And Romans chapter 12:18, who does that depend on? So it may not be easy, but is it possible to be peaceable even when it's not easy? And the answer to that quickly is yes. Notice what Jeff wrote about Romans 12, verse 18. There are circumstances, many actually, in which behaving in a godly way will cause one to be prized among his neighbors, even if they themselves are rather unbelieving. It is also pleasant to have an honest witness on your side, or a helpful neighbor to help pry loose a tree stump, or a godly man to look out for a wandering child. Where pride and anger and lust and impatience cause other neighbors to be a detriment, the believer should instead be kind and noble and useful. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Romans 12:18. What I loved about what Jeff wrote there, by the way, is the fact that he made Romans 12:18 practical, right? He looks at Romans 12:18, and They're nice flowing words, right? As much as within you is, live peaceably with all men. And we can say it. But what Jeff challenges us to do in the literature that he wrote was simply to put that to practice. What that means is the way I talk to my neighbors and my coworkers and my friends, the way I interact with them. And when somebody's seeking those who might be helpful in a circumstance, who are they going to look to? Am I the guy in the neighborhood that they know if you reach out to that guy, he'll be helpful? He when the stump needs pulled or whatever it is, right? You're going to have individuals that you seek out that you know will be helpful in various circumstances. And what we're being challenged to think about is that needs to be us as Christians. We need to be the kind of people that when our communities are looking for positive examples and they're looking for people that get engaged and get involved and are trying to be helpful and are willing to lend a hand, that shows we're peaceable, right? And when our neighbors and our people that we come in contact with on a regular basis see us as a peaceable person, see us as somebody who doesn't get fussy and argumentative and get angry all the time and just fuss over anything and everything, then it's going to be easier for us to keep peace and make peace with other people. But if we're always angry and grumpy and just, people just want to steer clear of us because they never feel like there's any peaceableness around us, then that's not really the messaging that Jesus would have. As much as within me is, live peaceable with all men. Do my part, in other words. And do my part despite what? Despite what others think or do. Do my part despite what other people think or do. I think sometimes what happens with us is we say, well, I'll be peaceable with him as soon as he is what? Peaceable with me. I'll be peaceable with him as soon as he's peaceable with me. And if that's our attitude and that's his attitude, there'll never be what? Never be peace. If he's determined, I'm not bending, and the other guy's saying, I'm not bending, I'm not reaching out. Well, I'm not reaching out. Well, then the next thing you know, all you've got is conflict and you can't make peace. As much as within me, I want to know that I want folks to know my hand's always out, right? I'm reachable. I'm accessible. That's because I want to be a peacemaker. I want to be peaceable with folks. We've already talked about all the qualifiers, right? And the main qualifier is truth. That's the one thing I can't sacrifice. But beyond that, I'm willing to sacrifice all kinds of things. Beyond the truth of God's Word, I'm willing to make all kinds of sacrifices to live peaceable with others. Talked to a fellow one time, he trapped me in a question, is really what he did. But he asked me a question. He said, Brian, if I had a dispute with my neighbor over 6 inches of a property line, he said, do you think it was right for me to argue with him? And I was like, really, 6 inches? You're going to argue over 6 inches of a piece of property? He said, but you got to understand, this 6 inches of property runs 2 miles long. And his question really was, well, does that make it any different? And how should I handle it? No, don't misunderstand me. If you resolve your properties, my point isn't go start handing over your land. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are some situations that come up that we get pretty petty about when we could work much more easily and simply and make peace much more quickly than we often do. Now, maybe it's not about 6 inches of property that's 2 miles long, but it could be other things, simpler things. And we just, I believe, need to be the kind of people that our community looks to and knows that that's the kind of guy that doesn't want confrontation. He's looking to argue with people. He's not looking to fuss over everything that comes up. He's not going to get mad at you if you ask him a question or bring some concern, right? That's who God wants us to be, so that we can promote this peacefulness that he desires. And that's the imagery we should give to the world. So then what obstacles often get in the way at being at peace with others. Okay, say it again. Yeah, pride's obviously one of them. What else? Personalities, right? If you ever, again, don't raise your hand. But have you ever just had? You're not intending to be argument, trouble causing, but just clash. You ever just clash? And right, we all that way. We all find ourselves sometimes in settings where personalities just aren't going to click as smoothly. But that doesn't mean we can have a right to be conflicting and not seek for peace. But that can happen. What else can happen that you maybe wrote down that cause an obstacle for peace? Control, yeah. And with that, I would add, sometimes peace doesn't come because I'm right and I'm going to be right, and I don't care what you say, I'm right, right? Well, I just said it, didn't I? But anyway, you get what I mean. Sometimes we get so determined that I've got to be validated that we're unwilling to even strive to make peace, control over that circumstance. Anything else you might have wrote down? Here's what the text said. But be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. And we talked a little bit about that in this Proverb study already. But be careful that what might be causing the lack of peace or the conflicts in some settings and circumstances is my attitude about it. And how I'm convinced, well, I'm right, and my opinion's superior to others, and all that kind of thinking. And then finally, what sobering fact is taught in Hebrews 12:14? Yeah, without holiness we don't have the Lord. Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. Pretty simple, isn't it? Pursue that peace. Pursue it with everybody in that holiness of God, because without which no one will see the Lord. That's the challenge that's set before us. And how much time and energy do we make? Listen, it's easy, and I say easy. Anybody can cause problems. It doesn't take any great effort to be a problem causer, a troublemaker. It doesn't take any great skill set. Anybody can do that. And we've all probably seen circumstances, been in circumstances where you can almost tell that's what somebody's doing, right? They know what to say to get a little stir going and a little hornet. They know exactly how to say it and who to say it to, and we've got to start maybe doing a better job recognizing that. And number one, not be that ourselves, but maybe not give in to that, and not allow folks who are just trying to stir trouble rob us and the environment we're in maybe from the peace that it could have. When you're with the Lord, Proverbs 16:7, when you're with the Lord, even your enemies like you. That's kind of what he's saying. You can even make peace with them when you use the Lord's ways and His path. And so when we find ourselves in those conflicts or in those challenges, just remember to stay the course with the truth of God's will and purposes, and allow the good He can produce in those environments to occur. Appreciate everybody's thoughts tonight in our study.